My sister Olivia always had a gift for curating appearances and casualties. She called me on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, her voice light and sugary, like a radio host pitching something for charity. Danielle, she said, stretching my name as if she were softening it. Our company's hosting a gala at the Art Institute next week. You should come. It'll be good for you. I stayed quiet, letting her words hang in the air. If you've ever swallowed silence for the sake of family peace, I hope this story finds you. Subscribe to Revenge with Seren, where dignity always echoes louder than applause. What Olivia meant by good for you was that she wanted to be seen as generous, inclusive, a big sister who still cared. She wanted the credit, not the company. I told her I would come. She seemed surprised, then gave me instructions like I was being onboarded into a temporary position. Dress code is formal. Try navy, not black. It blends into the wall. And get there a little early so I can introduce you to my team. Maybe someone can help you. Network. Her tone wrapped each word in polished pity. What she didn't know was that I had already met her boss years before she even applied for the job. I didn't explain that I had just returned from a panel at MIT or that I'd been consulting on STEM equity projects for the state of Georgia, that I was quietly funding 2 mentorship programs she'd likely seen her company promote on LinkedIn. None of that ever impressed Olivia. She measured success by title proximity to power and the kind of heels you could stand in all night without looking like you tried. On the evening of the gala, I arrived alone, stepping out of a black car into the soft churn of snow, dusting the Art Institute's marble steps. My dress was navy, structured, and quiet, exactly what she recommended. I tied my hair back and wore a single pair of pearl earrings, the kind of elegance that doesn't beg for comment. Inside the rotunda was bathed in soft gold lighting. Suspended glass orbs hovered above white-clothed tables, and jazz hummed faintly behind the polite clink of champagne flutes. Olivia spotted me from across the room, walking briskly toward me in a fitted cream blazer and heels that could kill a man in 3 steps. You clean up well, she said, brushing a curl from my forehead with the edge of her nail. Then she grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the bar. There she introduced me to a group of colleagues as if I were a distant cousin who had dropped by uninvited. This is my sister Danielle, she said, her voice feigning cheer. She's currently between things. Took a break from work. You know how it is. I smiled, a small practice smile, the kind you wear when someone's placing a blade between your ribs and calling it sisterly concern. The man next to her raised his glass lazily. That must be relaxing, he said, barely glancing in my direction before turning back to her. She laughed politely and continued talking about her recent presentation, her new lead on the account, her upcoming trip to LA. I might as well have been the bartender. I drifted away from the group, not wanting to linger where I wasn't wanted. Near the entrance to the grand hall, a woman was setting out printed programs, thick cardstock with embossed lettering, folded once like wedding invitations. I picked one up. The gala schedule was elegant and brief introductions, a recognition of donors, a guest musical performance, and one final item just before dessert. Keynote address Danielle Carter Novus Initiative. I folded the program carefully and slid it into my clutch. It didn't need to be waved in anyone's face. Just knowing it was there waiting was enough. Back at the tables, Olivia was still holding court. I watched her from a distance as she laughed, touched arms, tossed her hair just so. She knew how to own a room until the room remembered who built it. She had placed me at table 14, far from the company partners and executive guests. The place card read Danielle Carter. No title, no credentials, no mention of the keynote. Just a name like a footnote at the bottom of a resume no one would finish reading. The people seated near me were polite. A man from operations, his wife, a marketing associate who seemed exhausted. No one asked what I did. No one tried to make conversation. I didn't mind. I was used to the quiet. As the appetizer course arrived, a poached pear with arugula and balsamic drizzle, I caught a glimpse of Olivia a few tables away. She was pointing in my direction. I heard her laugh float across the floor. "She's sweet," she said, "always chasing ideas, but never really landed anywhere." I looked down at the polished silverware, at the glass, catching light just right. I reached into my clutch and touched the folded program again, and I waited. Because the thing about silence is it only feels powerless until the room hears your name from the stage. Have you ever listened to someone rewrite your life in public while holding the real story in your pocket? Tell me in the comments, because your quiet truth matters more than their loud assumptions. Dinner service had just begun when I noticed how far I'd been placed from the center of anything that mattered. Table 14 was tucked beneath an abstract installation in the back right corner of the gallery, positioned behind a service station where waiters whispered and dishes clinked in between courses. From where I sat, I could barely see the podium. That was intentional. Olivia had made sure I wouldn't be noticed. Her table, by contrast, was within arm's reach of the stage. She sat beside her boss, elegantly angled for photos, all laughter and hand gestures and white wine in the right stemware. There was a spotlight that swept the room in soft motion, and it somehow paused longer on her table than any other. The woman beside me leaned in. "Are you with the company?" I smiled. "No, just family." She nodded politely and turned back to her salad. That was the moment I began to count how many times I would be reduced to that word before the night was over. Just visiting, just a guest, just Olivia's sister, just unemployed, just background. I excused myself before the entree. The air felt tight around my ribs, and I didn't want to break in front of strangers. I moved toward the back hallway, toward a quieter space near the coat check where no one would follow. That was when I heard it. And we're honored this year to welcome a very special keynote speaker. She's the founder of the Novus Initiative and an advisor for several federal education coalitions. Her name may not be familiar to everyone, but her work has touched more than 4,000 students nationwide. The voice came from a small audio speaker mounted near the hall. I stopped mid-step. She will be joining us shortly to close out the evening. I stood still, invisible, under soft hallway lighting as a security guard passed me without notice. I looked down at my reflection in the glass panel of the museum's display case. My own face felt foreign, perfectly made-up, composed blank. I blinked, then reached into my clutch and unfolded the program again. There it was, my name, Danielle Carter, third from the bottom below 2 VPs and 1 CEO's wife, introducing the scholarship award. No title, no dramatic reveal, just a quiet presence waiting. As I turned back toward the gala, one of the waiters stepped into my path. He looked no older than 24, with a sharp jawline and careful posture. His eyes darted to my program, then to my face. "You're her," he said under his breath. His voice low with surprise. "You're the speaker." I gave him a soft smile. "I am." "I saw your name last year in a policy journal," he added quickly. "I'm applying for a grant your foundation runs. Novus STEM Fellowship." "Then you're exactly who I hoped would be here," I said, meaning it. His face flushed with gratitude. Before I could say more, he glanced behind him and disappeared through the kitchen door, carrying a tray of untouched desserts. That one moment steadied me more than 1,000 applause lines ever could. When I returned to my table, no one had noticed I'd been gone. The entrees had arrived lamb medallions for some lentil ratatouille for others. A woman across from me asked for a second glass of wine. The marketing associate now scrolled through her phone. All of it felt blurry, distant, like watching a play I no longer wanted a role in. I turned my head just enough to see Olivia still shining at her table. She held her posture like someone born for the frame, laughing at a comment from Mr. Halpern, lightly brushing his sleeve as she leaned in. I could almost hear her voice now. She's just between things right now, but she's trying. The word needled its way into my chest. Olivia had always used it like a veil, something she could hide my accomplishments behind, while still sounding supportive. I was never working. I was trying. I was never consulting. I was figuring things out. I was never leading. I was doing something small. Even when I built Novus from a single grant application into a national platform, she never once called it a job. Just Danielle's project. Back at the table, someone asked what brought me here tonight. "My sister," I said. "She works here." "Oh," came the reply, followed by silence. Not a single person asked the obvious question. "Then why are you the keynote speaker?" Because the truth is, they didn't see me. Not really. I was introduced to them by a woman they respected, and that introduction shaped the limits of their curiosity. People rarely look beyond the packaging if the label's already been applied. Still, I waited. I didn't need to defend myself to strangers. I didn't need to correct her story. The microphone would do that for me without raising my voice. After dessert was cleared, the lights dimmed slightly, and a hush fell over the room as the MC returned to the podium. Olivia crossed her legs and leaned in, expecting the donor presentation next. I watched her pick up the program and scan it absent-mindedly. Her lips moved slightly as she read, then stopped. I watched it happen, the slow realization. Her eyes snapped back to the program, then to the stage, then back to the line, "Keynote Danielle Carter." It was the only time that night I saw her expression falter. The silence between the MC's announcement and my name registering in Olivia's mind lasted no more than a breath, but in that breath everything shifted. I watched her blink, then lean closer to her boss as if seeking confirmation. Mr. Halpern flipped through his own program with a casual frown, nodding slightly as he reached the same line. His expression didn't change yet. I saw the slight adjustment in posture, the recalibration that happens when someone realizes they might have misjudged the entire room. I remained at table 14, still invisible to most of them. But that moment, that was mine. When the MC asked the guests to remain seated as the keynote speaker was escorted forward, Olivia's eyes swept the room. She was searching. I stayed where I was, for now, not out of pettiness, but out of purpose. I wanted her to see exactly what she had missed. I wanted her to feel for once the void left by an assumption. They had written me off before I even walked through the door. That's what stung the most, because this wasn't new. When I finished my master's in policy and education at Berkeley, Olivia was still in undergrad, majoring in communications. I had applied to 6 fellowship programs, that year flown cross-country with 1 carry-on suitcase, and spent nights in budget hotels while pitching my proposal to foundations I could barely get meetings with. I won 2 of those grants. The 3rd year, I had 5 employees. By year 5, Novus had satellite partnerships in 3 states and was quietly feeding the back-end data into platforms used by half a dozen public schools. I remember the day I told Olivia we'd landed a state contract. She blinked and said, "That's good. But when are you going to do something corporate?" Something corporate, as if that word was the only key to real legitimacy in her eyes. She never asked how I built a startup from an abandoned schoolroom in South Chicago. She never asked how I managed to employ 15 educators, or how I managed to pay them more than most entry-level tech jobs. Instead, she smiled at holiday dinners, tilted her head, and introduced me to her boyfriends as my sister. She's kind of between roles, but she does cool passion projects. Passion projects. I poured 5 years of my life into Novus. We secured $1.8 million in funding before I turned 35. I gave up salary, vacations, weekends. I was on first-name basis with assistant deputy directors at the Department of Education. But to Olivia, I was just her older sister who didn't have a proper job title. What she didn't know, what she never asked to know, was that her company's biggest community outreach initiative, the one they touted all over LinkedIn, the one they used to pitch themselves as inclusive and impact-minded. That was built on a licensing agreement with Novus. I signed it myself. I reviewed the contract, watched the logo draft, and signed the funding agreement under a shell foundation that feeds directly into Novus's outreach branch. Her entire department's most celebrated initiative exists because I signed a partnership she didn't know was mine. Because I never needed credit. I needed change. And now tonight in a room where she tried to relegate me to the farthest table, the credit was coming whether I wanted it or not. As I stood slowly from my seat, I caught the waiter's eye. The same one from earlier, the one applying for our fellowship. He gave me a respectful nod, a tiny smile of encouragement. I moved toward the aisle, feeling the soft press of dozens of eyes starting to notice. Olivia's jaw tensed. I walked the perimeter of the gala, not rushing, not looking to be seen, simply walking with the kind of calm you can only earn when you've already lived the truth others are just now discovering. The MC began to clap. A few tables joined in. I heard my name again, louder this time, spoken into a microphone that didn't know. My history didn't care about the version of me Olivia had carefully curated. Just Danielle Carter. I reached the stairs to the stage, and climbed slowly. As I stepped into the spotlight, I let my gaze settle gently across the crowd. I saw Olivia's table clearly now. Mr. Halpern leaned back, observing. Olivia sat forward, her fingers wrapped tightly around the stem of her wine glass. I didn't look away. Instead, I let the room quiet. No slide deck, no introduction reel. Just a woman in a navy dress, with a quiet voice and a story no one expected to matter. I stepped up to the podium, touched the sides gently, and I smiled. The first few seconds after I stepped up to the microphone were filled with silence, not tension, just the kind that stretches thin with curiosity. Most people in that room hadn't read the program in full. They had no idea who I was, and even less reason to care. But they listened, because something about stillness commands more attention than sound ever could. I looked across the crowd, eyes moving from table to table, not scanning for approval, but registering presence. I took a breath, soft and steady. When I was 27, I spent most of my mornings packing donated Chromebooks into repurposed milk crates and driving them across the south side of Chicago. Sometimes we didn't have enough power cords. Other times, I taught workshops without heating. Someone chuckled near the back, awkward and unsure. I let it pass. But what we lacked in polish, we made up for in structure. I built a platform, simple, clunky, functional, that let students access STEM labs without needing a fast connection or the latest device. We called it Novus. It was never meant to be big. It was meant to be useful. I didn't name Olivia's company yet. I didn't have to. Tonight I continued Some of you work for firms that have integrated Novus modules into your own platforms. Some of you sit on boards that approved funding agreements with our quiet little initiative. You probably didn't know my name. That's okay. My work was never about my name. The room was quieter now. Even the waitstaff had paused along the walls. I didn't scan for Olivia, but I could feel her. That platform she loved, showcasing on their website, the one that let them run virtual coding nights for underfunded high schools in Cook County, that was built on my team's 2018 interface. Her company had never modified the original backend, just changed the branding and rolled it out in a sleeker skin. I had reviewed the source code last quarter out of curiosity, and I had smiled. because there's a very specific kind of satisfaction in watching someone dismiss your qualifications only to unknowingly benefit from the very thing you built. I leaned slightly toward the mic. For years, I let other people introduce me as a founder, a director, sometimes unemployed, sometimes between things. I've been edited by family, misquoted by employers, and politely erased from press releases. And I stayed quiet. Not because I lacked voice, but because I knew the story wasn't finished yet. A few people shifted in their seats. I continued. But I think we all reach a moment when silence stops serving us. When the work is no longer enough to speak for itself. When the people around us start using our humility as a way to decorate their own narratives. I pause there, not dramatically, but intentionally. I wanted the weight of that line to sit. Tonight is not about me. It's about impact and the power of what can be done when someone believes in a mission more than in recognition. When someone decides the goal is not applause, but access. That was my pivot. Because while Olivia had spent years branding herself as an advocate, she never once asked who built the very access tools her job depended on. She was praised for programs she didn't understand, elevated for impact she didn't trace. Not because she was malicious, no. Olivia was just so used to standing in the center that she never thought to look behind the curtain. I finished the keynote without flourish. Just one simple line, I'm honored to be here, not because I was invited, but because I showed up anyway. Applause followed, not thunderous, but respectful. The kind that comes when people are still catching up to the truth. I stepped down from the podium and walked back along the side of the room, letting the noise dissolve behind me. As I neared the back, a man I didn't know stopped me. "You're Danielle Carter." "Yes." He extended his hand. "Your work helped my daughter. She was part of the Novus after-school program in Milwaukee. She's a software engineering major now." That was the moment I'll never forget. More than the applause, more than Olivia's face, that father's voice that was the echo I had worked for. I thanked him and continued toward the hallway, only to pause when I noticed a younger employee from Olivia's team stepping away from a nearby table. She looked flustered. Her eyes darted around as if she wasn't sure what to do. Then she approached me. "I just realized," she said breathlessly, "I forwarded a report to you 2 months ago and didn't know it. I used your system every day, and I thought it was some third-party nonprofit. It was," I smiled, "until today." She looked at me like she was looking at a whole new blueprint of how her company worked. "Thank you," she said simply, and returned to her seat. Meanwhile, Olivia hadn't moved. I watched her through the corner of my vision, still frozen, still sitting, still gripping her glass like a rope in deep water. She found me just as the applause was fading. Olivia stepped out from behind a pillar near the edge of the donor wall and walked toward me with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Danielle," she said calmly, as if everything were fine, "do you have a minute?" We moved a few steps away from the gallery's main entrance, just far enough from the crowd, but still within earshot of the soft jazz echoing through the marble walls. Olivia folded her arms, then looked me over from the hem of my dress to the clasp of my clutch. "You could have told me you were the keynote." I tilted my head. "You never asked." She blinked. The pause that followed wasn't long, but it was loaded. I saw it then, not confusion, not hurt, just calculation. She was scanning for where her image had slipped, for where she had lost control of the story. I just think she said, her voice low, "It would have been nice to prepare. I introduced you to everyone like you didn't have anything going on. I mean, I literally said you were between jobs." Her tone held that forced chuckle she used when she was nervous. Like she could laugh it all away if she smiled hard enough. I didn't laugh. She went on more defensive now. Then Halpern made a joke, said, "So that's your sister, the charity case," and laughed like it was no big deal. But it is a big deal. I look like an idiot. I felt the breath catch in my chest, not from her words, but from how easily she'd repeated them. Charity case. That was how they saw me. That was how she let them see me. "You've always looked at my work that way," I said quietly. "You just never said it out loud." Olivia frowned. "Come on. That's not fair." "No?" I asked. "Because every time I mention Novus, you changed the subject. When I sent you our education campaign last year, you said it was inspirational, not impactful, not important, just cute and inspirational, like I'd made something for a bake sale." Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I've been building this for a decade, Olivia," I continued, "and instead of asking what I do, you introduced me like a dependent. You've spent years shaping how others see me, and tonight, that version of me cracked." She stood there, lips pressed together, clearly unsure of whether to be embarrassed or furious. I could see her calculating again, searching for a way to turn the moment back in her favor. I didn't know she said, voice quieter now, "You never tell me anything." "I did?" "You just didn't listen. You were too busy curating your story." From the main room, I heard another round of applause. They were starting the charity auction. I didn't care who won the dinner with the CEO. I cared that my name had been spoken in that room for what it truly was, for what it meant. Not a footnote, not a guest, not a +1. "Why didn't you ever correct me?" she asked suddenly. "Why let me say all that in front of him?" I looked at her, then said the truth. "Because I wanted to see what you would say when you thought I had nothing." Her face paled. That was the part she hadn't considered. Behind us, a couple walked by with glasses of champagne. They glanced over, unsure whether they were witnessing an argument or a quiet moment between sisters. Olivia turned away slightly, composing herself. "I worked hard to get here," she said. "This isn't easy for me either." I didn't argue. I believed her. She had worked hard for a version of success built on image, proximity, and control. But tonight had reminded her that image is fragile and power doesn't always announce itself. "You're right," I said. "It's not easy. But the difference is, I never tried to make you small to feel big." That landed. I saw it. Not rage, not resistance, just a quiet folding inward. When I stepped back into the main hall, people were starting to rise from their tables, moving toward the gallery floor, where displays had been set up for viewing. A few guests nodded at me as I passed. One woman mouthed the word brilliant. Another clasped my hand gently and said, "You have no idea how much your work matters. My niece just got accepted into an engineering camp because of your mentorship program." I smiled, genuinely moved. "Thank you." Then I felt the shift behind me. "Mr. Halpern." He appeared beside me with a drink in his hand, his voice perfectly pleasant. "Ms. Carter," he said, "impressive work. I had no idea you were involved with the back-end educational modules we've been showcasing." "Not involved," I said. "I built the original structure. We just license it now." He raised his eyebrows. "Well, that changes things." I nodded politely. "Does it?" He paused. "You didn't feel the need to mention it earlier. I didn't think it would be relevant." I was introduced as someone between things. There was a long silence between us, and then he laughed this time, not at me, but uncomfortably at himself. "Well," he said, "you've certainly made a strong impression." I held his gaze. "I wasn't trying to. I just showed up as who I am." He excused himself soon after. I watched him disappear into the crowd, swirling his glass as he moved. He had no idea I'd already signed the next grant renewal he'd be chasing next quarter, through a foundation he didn't even know I controlled. And Olivia, she remained in the shadows, not humiliated, just quiet. And that was enough. The band had returned to their place beneath the arches, playing a mellow, jazzy version of something classic, something you were meant to hear but not remember. People filtered into the gallery space with renewed ease. Whatever tension had rippled through the room earlier had settled beneath the surface again, replaced with wine and applause and the hum of small talk. I stayed near the far wall, my name no longer a secret, yet still unspoken by the ones who used it for show. I watched Olivia from a distance. She was back at her table now, flanked by two junior staffers from her department smiling a little too brightly. She was performing composure. But every few minutes I saw her glance toward where I stood, just to check if I was watching. I wasn't. Not for her, not anymore. Just behind the stage, a projection screen lowered quietly into place. The MC returned with practiced enthusiasm, announcing the company's highlight reel for the fiscal year. A few guests cheered. Others clapped politely as the lights dimmed again. Then came the video. It opened with sweeping drone shots of underfunded schools, children at desktop computers, teachers logging into a familiar platform. I knew it all by heart. The footage was professionally edited music, color-corrected smiles, careful captions. I had written those captions 2 years ago. The screen showed charts of increased access, maps dotted with icons representing every city Novus had quietly touched. The narrator spoke of partnerships, collaboration, cross-sector innovation. They used all the right words, all the right images, and in the bottom corner of the dashboard, Just barely visible was the signature interface we had designed in our 3rd year of operations. The buttons, the lesson, flow the logic engine. I could have drawn them blindfolded. They hadn't even bothered to update the colors. They just slapped on a new name. People cheered when the stats came up: 82% student engagement, 44 new partner schools, over 15,000 learning hours logged. Olivia clapped too. Her smile returned. She even leaned over to say something to her boss, no doubt framing the numbers as a team win. But I knew every digit on that screen came from the engine. We had built an engine they didn't bother to credit, but couldn't operate without. I had no plans to interrupt, no urge to clarify. I didn't need a logo or a name drop. I had something more powerful: proof and patience. After the video ended, there was a toast. Mr. Halpern stood at his table and raised his glass high. To growth, he said, to the future, and to the people behind the vision. Everyone followed suit, echoing his words. Olivia's eyes glimmered. Her team leaned in, laughing, their faces lit by success. No one realized the software they were toasting had been carried on my back for years. No one except one. As I took a quiet sip of water, a young woman approached me, mid-20s, sharp suit notebook still clutched in one hand. Her badge read Emma H., Data Analyst. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said carefully. "Not at all." She hesitated. "I started working here 6 months ago. I've been managing the educational program metrics. Tonight was the first time I put your name together with all of this." Her voice cracked slightly, as if she were embarrassed to admit it. "I didn't design it for recognition," I said. "But I'm glad it's working." She looked down, thoughtful. "I always thought the back end seemed too structured for a third-party partner. We couldn't figure out why it didn't fully sync with our internal systems. Now I know it wasn't built for us." "No," I smiled. "It was built for the students. Your company just happens to be borrowing it." She laughed quietly, then turned serious. "They told us it came from a partnership grant. We thought it was from some foundation in D.C. "It is?" I nodded. "Sort of." That's all I gave her. She didn't press. She didn't need to. Some people recognize the architecture and respect the architect even if they never saw the blueprint. As she left, she turned back once. "Your work is cleaner than anything I've ever inherited." "Thank you for that." It wasn't a standing ovation. It was better. Later, as coats were retrieved and last glasses of champagne were finished, I walked once more through the rotunda, soaking in the gallery now bathed in cooler light. The crowd had thinned, conversations drifting into the entryway. Olivia stood near the exit chatting softly with 2 women from marketing. She looked collected again, poised, prepared to reclaim her version of the night. But as I neared, her voice lowered. Our eyes met for only a second. She didn't smile, neither did I, because something unspoken had passed between us earlier, something deeper than offense or pride. She had built her reputation on the idea that she was the one bringing others along. Tonight reminded her that not everyone behind her is behind because they're lost. Some just choose to walk quietly until the room turns. And now The room had turned. I had just stepped into the marble entryway when I heard someone call out, softly, cautiously, "Miss Carter." I turned. At first, I didn't recognize the man walking toward me. He was older than I remembered, taller, now dressed in a clean gray suit with his ID badge tucked inside his lapel. But then I saw the eyes. Curious, alert, always slightly squinting when he thought too fast. "Evan." He broke into a wide smile. "I wasn't sure it was really you until I heard the keynote. I interned with you 5 years ago. Summer term." "Of course, Evan." He had been barely 20, then sharp-driven, completely unsure of himself. I'd taken a chance on him, even when other mentors passed over his application for being too soft-spoken. He stood in front of me, now a full-grown man with confidence in his stance and gratitude in his voice. "I'm working in data integration now," he said. "Started here last year. I had no idea Novus was behind the learning system we've been piloting." "None of us did," I smiled. "That was the point. The work was supposed to speak louder than the branding." "Well, it did," he said sincerely. "Your work gave me a career path. I still remember what you told me the day I almost dropped out of the summer program." I paused. "What did I say?" He grinned. "You told me real work isn't always seen. That doesn't make it less real." I laughed. "I said that?" He nodded. "I wrote it down. It kept me going." "When I heard your name tonight, I almost couldn't believe it." Olivia's voice echoed behind us before I could reply. "Evan." I turned just slightly as she stepped closer, her tone pleasant but uncertain. She was clearly trying to read the interaction. "Oh, hi, Olivia." "Evan," said voice warming. "I didn't know you two were related." Her smile stayed fixed. "Yes, Danielle's my sister." He blinked. "She was my mentor during my internship. I owe her a lot, honestly. I wouldn't even be here without her." Olivia's gaze flicked from him to me, then back again. "That's great." There it was again. That subtle tightening of her mouth. The quiet unraveling of the image she'd built Olivia, the successful sister Olivia, the one who helped others. It must have burned to hear one of her own employees call me their foundation. She recovered quickly. "We're lucky to have Evan. He's done some amazing work on our analytics dashboards." I nodded. "I can tell. He always had range." Evan smiled, unaware of the shift in energy between us. "If it's not weird, could I email you sometime just to ask some career questions?" "Of course," I said gently. "It's not weird at all. I'm proud of you." We exchanged emails, his hand shaking slightly as he typed it into his phone. Olivia stood a little off to the side, her presence dimmed. For once, she didn't offer to help, didn't insert herself. She simply lingered as if unsure what role she still played. When Evan excused himself to speak with someone from HR, she turned to me. "You mentored him, yes. He never mentioned that." I looked at her. "Because it wasn't about you." She inhaled through her nose like someone preparing a response she couldn't quite shape. I always thought you worked alone, she said, the edges of her voice quieter than usual. That you just did solo projects. No one builds anything alone, I said. You just never asked about the people around me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Guests drifted past, wrapped in coats, thanking hosts, complimenting the decor. The event was beginning to exhale. I didn't know you were still involved, she said at last. I thought you'd stepped back. I never left, I answered. I just stopped explaining myself. She nodded, and to her credit, she didn't try to spin it, didn't try to reclaim the night. She simply stood there, staring into the distance, realizing that while she'd been building visibility, I'd been building infrastructure. One was louder, the other lasted longer. I stepped back into the foyer, leaving her in that quiet. Outside, the snow had started again this time, heavier, drifting sideways against the tall glass panels. The valet line wrapped halfway down the step. People stood with collars turned up and phones raised, scanning claim tickets. As I waited for my car, I thought about Evan, about the hundreds like him, students, interns, educators who had passed through Novus carrying pieces of our work into companies that never learned our name. That had been fine with me until tonight. Tonight reminded me that silence has power, but so does visibility when used with care. My driver pulled up headlights, streaking across the snowy stone. As I opened the door, I felt one last glance behind me. Olivia was standing just inside the gallery window, her arms folded, watching. The evening was nearly over. Most of the guests had drifted back into the gallery, their arms full of auction gift bags or clinking glasses. The energy had softened into that late-hour lull, the part of the night where the masks begin to loosen and people start letting truths slip between sips of wine. I returned to my table alone. Table 14 still sat half empty. A few place cards tilted at odd angles where coats had been tossed. My water glass was gone. So was the quiet woman who had offered me a seat at the beginning. She had left early, before the program, before the speech, before the names were sorted out. I sat for a moment and watched, not to be seen, but to see clearly. Olivia stood across the room, laughing again or trying to. She gestured toward something Mr. Halpern said, and tilted her head like she always did when she wanted to appear unbothered. But her eyes kept drifting. I caught her looking at me, and this time she did not look away. The MC's voice rang out once more, cheerful but hoarse. Before we close tonight, we'd like to ask all speakers and donors to join us near the stage for a final group photo and farewell acknowledgement. That was my cue. I stood up. The laughter around Olivia's table paused. I saw it. I felt it. Someone said something I couldn't hear, and then there was a chuckle. Not cruel, but dismissive, the kind of sound people make when they think you've misunderstood your invitation. One woman leaned toward Olivia and whispered, "She thinks she's part of the photo." I didn't react. I walked. Every step I took from table 14 to the front of the room pulled a string of silence behind it. It wasn't until I reached the spotlight that they realized it was turning not away from me, but toward. The coordinator standing near the stage held out a hand. "Ms. Carter," he said warmly. "Right this way. We've reserved the second row for you." Second row. I smiled and followed. The lights above the stage adjusted as the photographer raised his camera. Around me, people I'd never met nodded as I passed. A woman from legal whispered, "That was the best keynote we've had in years." A man from operations said, "You made me rethink my whole hiring pipeline." Olivia didn't speak. She didn't move. But Mr. Halpern did. He followed a few feet behind me, nodding toward the photographer, and then to the man placing guests. "Make sure Miss Carter is centered," he said. "We'll want her in the press shots." I didn't flinch. I didn't smile either. I just took my place, standing quietly, hands clasped, in front of me. The flash went off. The moment was preserved. Behind the camera, I could still hear soft murmurs, people asking who I was, why they hadn't known how they'd missed it. Olivia didn't answer any of them. She stood 3 rows behind, partly cropped, smiling tightly, no longer the one drawing the attention. After the photo, I turned to leave, but the MC caught my arm lightly. "If you have a moment, we're doing short testimonials with a few key guests. Would love a 30-second clip from you." I considered saying no. But something in the air, the calm that follows when truth has already done its work, told me it was safe. He guided me to a nearby corner where a camera had been set up against a velvet backdrop. "Just speak from the heart," he said. "Nothing rehearsed." The woman behind the lens nodded once and began filming. I took a breath. This room is filled with good intentions and loud success stories. But I found that some of the most meaningful work happens in silence, in shadows, without applause. And that's okay. Just don't confuse visibility with value. The woman blinked. "Perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." As I stepped back toward the rotunda, I felt a familiar voice behind me. "Danielle." I turned. Olivia stood a few feet away, alone now. Her earlier smile had faded, replaced by something thinner. Not regret exactly, but weariness. "I didn't realize you were staying till the end," she said. "You invited me." She looked down. "You know they're going to talk about this for weeks." "That I didn't know. That I introduced you the way I did." I didn't interrupt. "I didn't mean for it to come off that way," she added. "I just didn't know what you were doing anymore. You never asked." Her eyes met mine. "Do you hate me for that?" I paused. "No," I said truthfully. "But I don't need to explain myself to you anymore." She looked as if she might say something else, but she didn't. She nodded once, and for the first time that night, it wasn't dismissive. It was just quiet. The photographer called out again, asking for final group shots near the gallery exit. I walked past her without another word, because there's nothing left to say when the whole room has already heard what matters. After the final photo, the crowd began to thin. Women leaned into their coats, men scanned the exits for their cars, and staff began to stack programs and gather name tags left on tables. The soft clatter of event breakdown hummed beneath the last bits of conversation. I stood near a sculpture tucked in the side hallway, half lit and half forgotten. I wasn't hiding. I just didn't need to linger under the spotlight anymore. Let them talk. Let them try to reframe what had already unfolded in front of them. Then I saw him again. Mr. Halpern, drink still in hand, now loosened by the hour. He approached with the smile of a man who had questions but no idea how to ask them without sounding like he was backpedaling. "Danielle," he said, "hope I'm not interrupting. You're not. I have to say your keynote really shifted the tone tonight. In a good way." I said nothing. He cleared his throat. "The part about funding, about building programs that don't seek visibility. That struck me. Not many people think that way." "That's the problem," I said softly. He chuckled, unsure if I was joking. "Fair enough. Listen, I've been thinking. That data integration project we've been piloting, how much of that came from your original system?" I turned to look at him, letting the pause linger, just long enough. "All of it." He nodded slowly. "Impressive. Honestly, that platform's the most stable thing we've rolled out in 3 years. "It was designed to last," I replied, "not to impress." He looked away for a moment, adjusting his tie. "The truth is, we didn't do a great job tracing back the partnership. It came through a secondary foundation. We just assumed it was part of a coalition grant. It was. I wrote it. That was the first time, and I saw him stumble, not in his step, but in his assumption. He didn't expect that. Didn't expect the woman he dismissed as between jobs to be the architect behind one of his flagship outreach programs. You wrote it, designed. The system built the early logic, ran the funding pipeline through a silent partner so your firm could meet its DEI metrics without realizing where the support came from. I thought it would serve better that way." His voice lowered. "You're telling me you've been funding our outreach. I'm saying I knew what your company needed before you did, and I knew what your employees like Evan deserved." He didn't laugh this time. He didn't deny it either. Instead, he looked around, then leaned closer. "Why didn't you say anything? You could have leveraged that into a board seat, a contract, something public." "Because I wasn't looking for leverage," I said. "I was looking for impact." He blinked. I continued. "But if I had said something earlier, would you have listened? Or would you have heard only what Olivia told you to expect?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The hallway filled briefly with a round of polite laughter from the gallery. Someone made a joke about auction paddles. But here in this space, all I heard was the weight of realization settling into the man in front of me. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "No," I said gently. "You judged what you were told." That distinction mattered, because it wasn't just about what he assumed. It was about what Olivia had framed, polished, and offered on a silver plate, a sister in transition. Harmless, unremarkable, someone safe to disregard. But truth has a funny way of moving. Quiet at first, then undeniable. He excused himself shortly after, said something about reconvening with his team on Monday to reevaluate some allocations. I didn't follow. I didn't offer help. I'd already done enough of that behind the curtain. As I turned back toward the main entrance, I noticed the final event display near the coat check. A glass panel engraved with the words, "Tonight's gala, sponsored in part by our silent donors." It was the first time I saw my own impact reflected without my name attached. And yet, everyone who needed to know now did. I didn't linger. I had no desire to stand around while they tried to piece together how they'd missed it for so long. That wasn't the point. The point was the work. The point was the students, the intern who stayed, the analyst who noticed, the girl in Milwaukee who would now code because of a laptop that ran on my system. At the door, a staff member helped me with my coat. As she handed it over, she glanced at me with quiet recognition. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." I nodded, slipping my arms through the sleeves. Outside, the night had turned colder. The snow had stopped falling, but the ground glowed with a hush of freshly covered sidewalks. A car pulled up. Not mine, someone else's. I waited, and just before I stepped out into the open, I looked back through the tall gallery windows. Olivia was standing near the buffet table, arms folded, speaking to no one. Her smile had faded. Her posture had changed. Not angry, not even embarrassed, just aware. For the first time, she was seeing the room not from the center, but from the edge. And she finally understood what it meant to be underestimated, while someone else had been building everything quietly behind her. The gala was over, but the emails had already begun. I hadn't even left the valet stand when my phone buzzed first with a calendar request, then a forwarded message chain from a contact I hadn't heard from in months. The subject line read, "Re-Novus Initiative Funding, Source Urgent, Clarification Typical." By the time I got into the car, 3 more messages had arrived, each one a little more careful in tone, a little more curious, and all from people who had sat no more than a few feet from me, but only now seemed to realize that I hadn't just shown up for dinner. They'd toasted success that evening under a projection screen built on the infrastructure I created, with numbers I generated using systems funded by a foundation they'd never bothered to investigate. They just called it support from DC, or a quiet donor partnership. No one thought to look closer. And that had always been the point. Back when I started Novus, I knew 2 things. First, that visibility often invited scrutiny before impact. And second, that some doors only opened when the person holding the key wasn't seen as a threat. So I created the foundation, not under my name, not under Novus, just a quiet, registered trust with a purpose. We funneled funds into programs like Olivia's firm to expand educational access with one condition: no public attribution, no press releases, no donor dinners, no naming rights, just results. Until tonight. Tonight someone had flipped the light on. And it wasn't me. I hadn't said the words. I hadn't held up the receipts. But they all knew now. From Evan's praise to Mr. Halpern's uncomfortable admiration. From the look Olivia wore after the group photo. The dots were connecting without my help. The anonymity that had once protected my work had now become a mirror forcing them to see what they'd chosen not to. Inside the car, I scrolled once more through the message from one of Olivia's senior directors. It was polite, full of questions. We'd love to reconnect regarding our education pipeline. Were you involved in structuring the 2021 licensing grant? Also, Would you be open to consulting formally in Q1? I didn't reply, not yet, because that wasn't the real message I cared about. The one that mattered came later, hours after the gala, long after the wine had worn off, and the masks were set aside. It was from Olivia. Her text was short. Was it you? The whole time I stared at the screen, not surprised, but struck by how little she had ever really asked me anything that mattered. I tapped out a reply, paused, then erased it. Then I wrote yes. But it was never about proving it to you. No punctuation, just truth. I didn't hear back from her, but I didn't need to, because silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's the sound of realization settling like snowfall, soft cold, and impossible to ignore once it touches your skin. The next morning I received a message from Evan. Miss Carter, people here can't stop talking about you. They're rereading the contracts now, trying to map the funding. It's kind of incredible. Thank you again. That one I replied to. You earned your seat. All I did was hold the door open. He didn't know that was a reference to something I'd told him years ago when he was still scared to speak up in meetings. Back then, he thought power meant volume. Now, he knew better. A few days later, I got a formal invitation from Olivia's company's board asking me to consider sitting on their advisory council. I declined. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to withhold, but because some lessons don't need to be co-signed. They just need to be lived. Besides, I already had another program underway in Detroit, and a school district in New Mexico had just asked if we could train their educators. That's where I was going next. Not to be clapped for, but to keep building. Weeks passed. The gala faded into memory for most. But not for Olivia. I knew that by the way she hesitated before forwarding me a newsletter article that referenced my name. Local tech nonprofit reveals keynote speaker was anonymous donor behind city's top education initiative. She didn't add a note, just the link. It was the first time she'd acknowledged the work without trying to reshape it. And for once, that was enough. Because the people who once called me unemployed or in transition or Olivia's sister now understood something she never had to say out loud. I wasn't just at the gala. I funded the reason they held one in the first place. It took Olivia 3 weeks to reach out again. Not through a text, not through a carefully worded email. She showed up. I was walking out of a community education summit downtown when I saw her leaning against the railing near the sidewalk, arms crossed heels, scuffing softly against the concrete. She looked out of place among the educators and nonprofit leaders trickling out behind me, overdressed, overprepared, like someone who wasn't used to being the one waiting. I figured this was the only way you'd actually stop, she said. I paused. You came here, she shrugged. I checked your event schedule. I thought, maybe we could talk. I didn't say no. We walked to a nearby cafe, quiet tucked into the corner of a brick-lined alley, mostly empty, on a weekday afternoon. She sat across from me and pulled her sleeves up like she was bracing for surgery. I've replayed that night more times than I want to admit, she said after a long silence. Not just what I said, but what I didn't say, what I never asked. I stirred my coffee, slowly letting her sit in it. I wasn't cruel, just still. I introduced you to people as if you were a tag-along, she added. And the worst part, I did it without thinking. It was automatic. That's the part that hurt, I said calmly. Not the words, the instinct behind them. She nodded, lips pressed together. I thought I was protecting you, making things easier. No, I said gently but firmly. You were protecting your image, and you thought making me smaller would make you seem bigger. She didn't deny it. I was wrong, she said. I mean, obviously. But it's deeper than that. You built something real, and I didn't just miss it. I actively ignored it. That's not new, Olivia. Her eyes dropped. Why didn't you say something, she asked. Why didn't you correct me sooner? Because I was tired of proving I mattered. I didn't want to fight for visibility. I just wanted to do the work. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, a city worker watered potted trees lining the sidewalk. A couple walked past the window, laughing about something neither of us could hear. Inside, the quiet hum of the espresso machine buzzed low and steady, the kind of background sound that fills in the space when two people are unsure how to move forward. I think I needed you to stay small, she finally admitted, because I didn't know who I was without being the successful sister. I never considered that you could outgrow that role that you already had. She said it without flinching. It landed heavier than any insult ever had. I didn't respond right away. I let the honesty breathe. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice low. I wasn't trying to outshine you. I just stopped hiding. She looked up at me, her eyes different now. Not defeated, not resentful, just quieter. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, but I do want to try to understand. I want to know what I never asked. That part? That was new, so I gave her a thread. I told her about the teachers I met in rural counties, about the interns who returned as program leaders, about the mothers who cried when their kids got into engineering camps because of our software. I told her about the boardrooms I entered anonymously and the schools I funded without ceremony. She listened, fully. No interruptions, no defense. I never would have believed you'd be the one holding the reins, she said softly. But now I realize you always were. I just wasn't looking. The shift had already happened. I didn't need an apology to feel it. She wasn't speaking from the stage anymore. She was speaking from the floor. And I wasn't reaching up anymore. I was standing in my own center, no longer asking to be seen. When we parted ways outside, she pulled her coat tighter and hesitated. Would it be all right if I told people what you really do now? I smiled. You can. But they'll find out eventually whether you do or not. She gave a quiet laugh this time without ego. Maybe one day I can help, she added. Actually, help! I nodded. We'll see. Because I had learned the difference between an apology and a shift. And this time, I wasn't reaching for the words. I was watching the posture. It was a month after the gala, when I returned to that same rotunda, this time not as a guest, not as a keynote, but as myself. No invitation, no speech to give, just a private viewing before the next round of grant renewals. The halls were quiet, dimly lit before the staff arrived. It was early morning, and the scent of lemon polish and cold stone echoed beneath my steps. I moved through the space slowly, my heels muted against the polished floor, passing the same walls where Olivia once stood, where I had once been introduced as a charity case. But today no one needed an introduction. The gallery staff greeted me by name, Ms. Carter. Would you like coffee while we finish setting up the files? I nodded gently. Thank you. They didn't ask what company I was with. They already knew. My name was listed on their new donor wall, quietly engraved in silver, beneath the words, Visionaries in Access. Not the largest plaque, not centered, but placed where it mattered directly above the portfolio of grants my foundation funded across the Midwest. I didn't ask for it. Someone on their board had done it quietly after the gala. At first I considered asking them to remove it. But then I thought of Evan, of Emma, of the father in Milwaukee who had shaken my hand. And I realized this wasn't a spotlight, it was a map. For the next person who was told they weren't corporate enough, for the next woman who was introduced as just in transition, for the sister who was quietly doing the work while someone else held the microphone. That wall was for her. Later that afternoon, I attended a private luncheon hosted by the city's Office of Public Education. It was a gathering of policymakers, district leaders, and community funders. I arrived early, as I always did, alone, as I often was. When I stepped into the room, heads turned, not out of curiosity this time. Out of recognition, I felt it, the difference. The way people moved toward me now, not to ask who I was, but to share who they had become because of something we built. Ms. Carter, your pilot program helped us raise reading scores by 18%. Danielle, would you be willing to advise on our next outreach model? I told my daughter about your story. She's applying to MIT. I thanked each of them, not because I needed the praise, but because I had learned how far acknowledgement travels when it's given to someone who never asked for it. Before I left the event, Olivia arrived. I hadn't expected her. She didn't work in public education, but she approached quietly, more carefully than before. I was invited as a +1, she said, slightly amused. Figured I'd see what it felt like. We both smiled, a real one this time. She looked around the room. You know everyone here? No, I said, but they know the work. She nodded. I'm learning to listen for that. As the event closed, a local official invited us to the front of the room for a small presentation. They were unveiling a new scholarship named after anonymous women funders who had transformed access in underserved districts. I didn't walk up. I didn't need to. They unveiled the banner. In fine print, one of the scholarships read, The Carter Initiative Fellowship, in honor of work done quietly but thoroughly. Olivia looked at me. She didn't cry. She didn't gush. She just whispered, It fits you. And in that moment, I didn't feel erased. I felt whole. When I left, I didn't turn back to see if anyone was watching, but I knew. Because dignity does not need applause. It just needs enough light to walk forward without needing permission. What stays with me is not the recognition. It's the silence she carried and how she built her legacy anyway. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to Revenge with Seren, where kindness is never weakness and silence always has a voice.